So again, all that she said about, you know, what I do believe are, um, as the saying goes, hypocrisy is a tribute that vice pays to virtue, and at the end of the day, concerns about stock levels and military equipment and international law are actually convenient excuses to dance around the topic that I think is central in the minds of Western policymakers, and that is fear of inadvertent or accidental escalation, and strategic stability, really, which brings us to the fifth chapter. I think the most important, in my perspective, chapter of the report, and that is what should be and what are the parameters that should guide NATO strategy. You point out that you weren't laying out a strategy per se for NATO, but rather setting up the parameters and considerations, factors that have to be accounted for. So maybe, especially since there is a great graphic in your report, maybe let's jump to the concept of centers of gravity for NATO, for change NATO, right? Um, both in a almost esoteric terms of cohesion and the uniting goal, uniting threat perspective, and then going down to a theater center of gravity. So I'll share screen, show the slide, and then please take it away. Mm.
So the why did I bring up centers of gravity? Actually, Sakir Gavoli uh, raised it a few weeks ago and said our center of gravity has moved to the east. But he didn't get down into explaining it, and I thought it was worth. And by the way, I'm not making any claim that he would endorse this, but I tried to explain it to myself, and of course, the origin of centers of gravity is Clausewitz, and there's a lot of various confusing interpretations. I think the best scholars on Clausewitz identify that he really laid out three different levels of center of gravity. One is the commitment of the political entity, and that it has a binding force in it to defend the collective assets. He was thinking of it in terms of an individual a nation, but there's no reason why it can't be an alliance. And I think when you look at it, NATO does stand for things. And the number one thing that NATO stands for is collective defense. That is, it's an association of people who are trying to help each other collectively defend their area. And there are certain principles about uh, uh, democracy, representative government, open society, treating people fairly, and so forth, which loosely are called kind of Western values. Then below that, in his hierarchy, are sort of what we would typically call theaters. And a theater is not exactly where the battles take place. It is the area in which a whole series of individual battles or operations or campaigns will take place. And then now, in German, center of gravity is also interpreted as Schwerpunkt, which we in English tend to think of it as kind of an offensive term. So this is his third level. So you say the Schwerpunkt, the point of main effort, and then you'd kind of think of it having a big arrow on the front of that. But that can also be a Schwerpunkt, can also be a center of main defense effort. And each theater has a number of these, which are in combination can actually define the defensibility of the theater. So when we sat down and looked at it, and you kind of go, okay, um, you naturally have the center and Poland. So during the Cold War, originally we had what was called COMZ, a communication zone, and American taxpayers spent millions building up highways and port facilities in France. Then France pulled out of NATO, so we ended up then NATO actually paid for the infrastructure, most of it coming into the Benelux countries, and then and Germany was sort of the collection point and the front line. Today, the Benelux and Germany have taken that COMZ role, and Poland has become kind of the assembly area in the center. So it just like Germany had to double function, the assembly of area of joint allied effort. And you remember at the height of the Cold War, we had eight core national corps and from UK, Netherlands, Belgium each had a corps. The US had 2 corps. The Germans had 3. The French had a corps. All with forces, and the Danes were signed to drop down and support the First German Corps. That multinational force was there to defend the front line. Well, you're seeing elements of that happen today. So Poland is now the reception area, and people are starting to talk about lining up of forces that can go there. Adjacent to Poland are the Baltic states, and you have the difficulty, that narrow gap to get to the land link. You try to sneak by Kaliningrad, infamous Suwalki Gap, and Belarus, and it gets kind of difficult carrying stuff all the way up through those countries, and they're small, and they do not have large forces, and they do not have large active forces. They do not have an air force, so they are extremely vulnerable to kind of preemptive attack. An attack, by the way, the Russians practiced in Zapad 2019. The Zapad 1999, 2009. 2013, 2017, and 2021. Okay, so I'm sorry, but this is kind of on the Russian mind. Right? Now, what's interesting, and it's very difficult to support them, and particularly if the Baltic Sea is between the Russian garrison and fleet in Kaliningrad and also St. Pete. Now all of a sudden you have a new opportunity. You have Finland, okay? And they offer the ability to close the St. Petersburg estuary, okay, and access to it. They offer the ability to overlap with the
Estonian.
Yeah. And then you have Sweden. What is Sweden? Sweden ends up having the strategic support role that pulls that all together. 2 ways. It supports Finland. It supports the integration with the Swedish Air can provide the air support for the Baltic states that NATO cannot, in terms of sorties and accessibility, and it overlaps with Poland. So all of a sudden now you have these 2 theaters overlapping with each other and having a synergistic effect. You look to the south of Poland. Why is Poland so upset about the deal on Ukraine, other than, in addition to being good people and identifying with a neighbor who's being mercilessly attacked? Because if you look at the Zapad exercise of 2017, that ran all the way from the North Cape all the way down to the Black Sea, and the Russian gaming of it, it ended with two armies on the Polish-Belarusian border and 2 armies on the Polish-Ukrainian border. All of a sudden, you're facing not, a few guys in Belarus, you're facing four major armies. And they were then the best four armies in Russia in terms of equipment and so forth. So that overlap is really is really important. So Ukraine offers this. So just as Sweden is the center of gravity for the north, but its members are the front line. Ukraine is a reception area and a frontline state. A reception area coming with whatever support would come. A lot of air bases, so NATO wanted to restage air. If you look at Belarus, all of a sudden Belarus, instead of looking like a dagger, looks like a target. Right? He's surrounded. If you have northern and southern gravities integrated with the Polish center of gravity. The Ukraine in the southern region is stronger. It has not only the largest force, but the best trained force. So if NATO, Ukraine in many ways, for the security of the South, NATO needs Ukraine as much as Ukraine needs NATO. So that's sort of the construct, and it makes sense.
Especially if you remember that, again, and you said that before, but Russia's aggression against Ukraine is a system-altering war, right? And you could also see in Lavrov's demands laid out in December 21, they extended far beyond Ukraine, and
absolutely,
it was basically a demand for a sphere of influence. The thing is, any pretenses Russia might have had to its own sphere of influence were broken over Kiev, right? Well, at least temporarily laid to the grave, right? Because again,
so if Putin could see where he is now on the 23rd of February, he would have to be a complete idiot to go, yeah, why not? Let's pull this thing off. I mean, look what it's cost him. He's not unified NATO like no one ever believed it could. It's strengthened Ukraine, and now he's got the whole north. The northern center of gravity unified with some very capable assets. I mean, it's just you would think that you would if you were an honest Russian who was thinking about Russian security, you go, "This guy's a traitor. He really screwed us."
Yeah. And everybody has seen his incompetence, least of which China, right? It's China. Even Macron. I don't know if you've heard Macron's speech. Just a little side note. In Macron's speech in Bratislava during GLOBSEC. And I'm a connoisseur of Macron's speeches, not because they are good. Usually they aren't, but this one was genuinely good. And I also like how he construed a very realist argument, saying that Russia has not proven that it deserves a place as an integral element of European security architecture, basically because it failed, right? It simply failed. But if we could circle back to the report and what you said about the Baltics and Suwałki Gap, the thing is, and we saw both, as you point out. Well, now we saw at least rumors of Wagner Group being repositioned, parts of Wagner Group being repositioned to Belarus. Whether that will prove to be the case or not, I don't know. But there are rumors, as you pointed out, the First Guards and I think the 8th, right? If I'm not mistaken.
Well, at least the First Guards.
At least the First Guards.
Pretty strong reports of that one. The others maybe not.
And
but also the air and the nuclear weapons.
Yeah, but the thing is, if you want to defend Suwałki Gap, I mean, if you want to defend the Baltics, it's almost impossible to do if you don't do active defense as Poland against Belarus. The thing is, it's gonna be very difficult. I have a hunch that it's gonna be very difficult to convince not just the Americans, but especially all the other NATO states that active defense is what we need, especially when there are nuclear assets stationed in Belarus. No matter what is the mode, of their stationing, it's probably not nuclear sharing. Probably they have very little to say about how and when those assets would be used. But Putin or Russia essentially has backstopped any risk of Poland doing offensive action against Grodno, for example, or the rivers in Grodno.
So,
And
but let me demur a minute. If you have the North integrated as a center of gravity, with Sweden in the alliance, particularly Swedish fleet and air,
yeah,
the Russians are going to have they're going to have one hell of a fight
they're not
going
getting
on.
out of St. Pete, right? Yeah.
And they're going to have a much harder time knocking off the three or any one of the Baltic states. I think the Baltic states, by the way, in this process have learned a lesson I've debated with the Estonians, the Latvians in particular. I go, you need some tanks. You need, oh, no, we don't need tanks. I think they learned a lesson. I wouldn't be surprised if 5 years from now you'll see some, at least some armor, serious armor in those states. If not by them, at least by other NATO contributors. And if you have Ukraine on the southern side of Belarus, it means that you have surveillance of the entire length of Belarus from both sides.
Sure.
All of a sudden, it looks very tense. By the way, just a couple of days ago, Lukashenko said that he got back his nuclear weapons and that he has the authority to launch them. Now, whether that's true or not, who knows? But if you take it as face value, that is something that I don't think it can be dismissed just by assumption.
The thing is, and this brings us to escalation and strategic stability. It was dismissed by the West largely. Those in the same way that, and I did a fairly, not incredibly, but fairly in-depth study of nuclear signaling that Russia did and responses of the West and the US. And time again, when you heard Kirby talk, or rather, US defense and state officials talk in response to Russian threats, they would always say that they are not particularly concerned. They don't see a reason to increase readiness or to do any nuclear posture changes, both declarative policy or actual, capabilities. And this brings us to what you said about, the need to really go back to roots of flexible response, although kind of out of board, right? Because you don't propose flexible response, you propose reciprocal response. Yeah.
So NATO's not had a serious military strategy.
Exactly.
If
you could describe, because it was a very important thing, how you describe how our strategy was formed and how it in no uncertain terms really laid out what is the threat, what is the response, what was the declarative language at least of NATO. I have some quotes, but I'll let you take it away for now.
So in short, when the United States had massive nuclear superiority, the view was, well, Russia, and remember, there was a massive set of Russian armies in Eastern Europe, and then all on the Western side, in what's now the Baltics and Belarus, Ukraine, and so forth. So NATO did have this impression or fear of having its thin line being overwhelmed by this mass. So NATO said, okay, we'll use nuclear weapons. Well, as Russia stockpile grew, wait a second, just because some guys drive tanks across the inter-German border, I don't want to commit Armageddon. And then others would, well, if we don't do that, then we lose credibility. And then it was back and forth, back and forth. And so the sort of solution of it was flexible response, and it had 3 steps. So the first step was called direct defense, which was conventional, but you could use, for example, nuclear artillery on your own territory at the border to break up mass concentration.
Edge of battlefront area, battle space area, right? It was called back then.
Yeah, core area, kind of basically.
If I could just interject, there was a very nice, precise definition of direct defense, which really laid out what will be done and the mode, right? It was, and it had deterrent value, right? Which is sorely missing right now from NATO strategic concept of last year, right? Yeah.
So then the second level was, okay, if the Russians are using nuclear weapons back, or if your defense is failing, even with the tactical nuclear weapons, you can then attempt to seize the initiative by some escalatory means. And there were a whole number of different steps and so forth. And then at the top was the link that, if these things are flying off all over the place, no, we're not going to allow Russia to play a game where we and Russia are fighting a nuclear war on Europe, and they're going to go home untouched. And so that is the link to strategic intercontinental strength. The challenge of it was the onus of first use was on us. And what I mean by the onus is because you can literally destroy your society with these things. I mean, it won't necessarily end the world, but you can damn well be, Russia has almost a certainty of being turned back, not to the Dark Ages, but to the Stone Age. Okay.
McNamara had his calculations, right? 25% of populations have, or 75% of industrial capacity, was it?
You can run all the calculations, but it's horrific. And Putin said a couple of years ago, well, nuclear war is bad, but I'm convinced God will protect the Russian people.
They'll go to heaven, he said.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, we'll go to heaven in a fiery chariot again. So that was the construct. But the challenge, the difficult challenge, was to be the first one to fire nuclear weapons, because you didn't know where it would end out. And for example, when we played it out in Proud Prophet, once nuclear weapons released, within 7 days, you were at Armageddon. Okay? And that was one of the most realistic exercises ever done. So, and the Russians are stupid. I ran the only effort to interview Russian general officers at the end of the Cold War on kind of their lessons of the Cold War and stuff. And we interviewed, I don't know, 20 or 30 of them. And they told stories about, trying to do an exercise, and Gorbachev was, Brezhnev was supposed to push the button.
Speaking with his daughter, wasn't
he? His hand was shaking so bad he wouldn't do it because he'd go, you sure it's an exercise? Anyway, it's one thing to throw the words around. It's something else. Now, it doesn't mean that there's not crazy people, and it doesn't mean that somebody who's backed in a corner and feeling sorry for himself plays, the Adolf, right, and tries to bring the house down on top of him. It's not clear that other people in his elite or in the military chain of command will necessarily follow that, but no one can be sure. The point is, though, today we don't have to be the ones to depend on the first use of nuclear weapons. So then the question is, not just with nuclear weapons, but with conventional weapons as well, is how do you determine a response? So, as we said earlier, Russia has fired 2,000 long-range missiles in Ukraine, and somehow it's illegitimate for Ukraine to be able to do the same thing back. And this is the syndrome that we were trying to argue against in the paper. Mm-hmm. So, no, you do not have to make the very, very difficult choice of initiating nuclear fire. If he does, you do have to have the will to respond reciprocally. Okay, so But the same principle also applies using strategic means, long-range strategic means, against countries that don't have the reciprocal ones, but who are members of the alliance. You have to have an ability to respond. So, we have a round number of maybe 300 B-61 bombs. They're air delivered by 30, 40 planes based on 5 NATO airfields, which are pretty vulnerable. That's probably not enough to have a robust response. NATO turned down putting land-based missiles with nuclear weapons on its territory a couple of years ago.
I think those were conventional because that was the INF, but there is always, I remember how freaked out Russians were about this. I think it was, I don't know if it was SM-6, it was probably before. No, I remember. It was about VLS-41s. This was another thing. They were freaked out just about the VLS, even though they weren't supposed to carry Tomahawk, like land-based versions of Tomahawk, but it was enough to freak them out. Trump used it over.
It's okay for them. It's okay for them to put nuclear weapons in Crimea. It's okay for them to move them in and out of Kaliningrad. It's okay for them to put, but it's not okay for NATO to respond.
Yeah.
And by the way, in the United States, we made a mistake. The nuclear planning group had recommended and proposed the previous administration to put some sea-based assets available to NATO. And that got rejected by this administration. Now, whether that's going to happen, but my point is not to solve the issue, but to point out that to have a strategy of reciprocal response, which is a very reasonable strategy, you need a more survivable and demonstrative capability, so that you're not sitting there with Russians having 2,000 tactical theater nuclear weapons and you got 300. Do you have to have it match them in the same number? No. But do you want a huge disparity? No. And then the last point, I think. So anyway, that's the argument on escalation. Herman Kahn, as you know, did the famous book on escalation, and I don't think it's in his book, but I remember having a discussion with him in the early 70s, and he said there was a group of us, I don't know, maybe 15, and so he turns to the group and he's sort of playing the Socratic professor, and he goes, if I hit you with this, what's the best thing to hit me with, and but still not have it go out of deal? And people say, well, if you hit me with one, then I hit you with two, and then people, there were all kinds of things. Mm-hmm. And he goes, no, one for one. He called it the Talmudic, from the Talmudic response. He said that when you game it out, that is the most successful strategy for getting the other side to quit and not have it escalate.
So basically deny them escalation dominance, right? Escalation control. Yeah. This is the bottom line. Yeah.
So they have escalation dominance if you don't respond.
Yeah. If you don't respond, if you don't signal resolve by having the capabilities required and declarative posture, and all of those things are missing, unfortunately. The thing is, and this is interesting when you go back to MC 14-3 or /3 and flexible response. The thing was, and credibility of U.S. deterrence and umbrella, which extended to Western Germany. But remember that Western Germany, the big topic of debate, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, was the German nuclear program and the fear that Western Germany will go for nukes, right? At a certain point in time. And the US...
I don't think that was, that was, no. I mean, it maybe in kind of a long-term theoretically. No, it was, no. So we had 7,000 nuclear weapons a year.
Sure.
So, and you needed, we faced a tough issue. We don't face that today. Now, I raised the question in the paper, but I'm not I sort of hint at it, but if you have those three centers of gravity, and they themselves see the importance of each of not only each of them surviving, but each of them being interrelated to the other. You know, in theory, any one of those, or in combination, they could over time have a independent nuclear capability. I mean, Sweden's had a bomb design.
Sweden had a bomb pretty much ready. Yeah, it's one of the great. If I could interject, I must, because this is a question that's been bugging me. I really don't understand, and I remember reading Frank Gavin. I think it was in his book, Nuclear Statecraft, that he himself could not really conclusively figure out why the Swedes decided to put their eggs in non-proliferation baskets. So because this is insane. I would have always went the Galway, you know, but the Swedes didn't.
Well, but no, there's a couple of reasons, but one of the most important ones, you get yourself on a very big guy's target list, and you get on the target list before you're even ready. Okay,
Oh, sure.
So the last thing you want, Israel played it smart, is they kind of hid their program, or at least kept it ambiguous, and but you don't want to do what Saddam Hussein did and start talking about your program before you have it. so you better do it in secret, and then be able to roll it out and make sure that it.
Look, you develop latent capabilities. I mean, South Korea, Japan. You can have most of the things needed without really being too obnoxious about it, right?
So
if you have a
but it's a very far better road is having an alliance that already has a integrated system. It has the command and control system, and it's much easier,
Yeah.
much more credible, and much safer to bring to first of all recognize that that's the need, and then build the capability within it, because the other one gets
dodgy.
challenging
It
very
does,
quickly.
yes. But again, I agree. But you also and you raise the possibility, because you can't really live in a world where a nuclear power loses conventional war and backstops it. Not just backstops defeat, but backstops not achieving some rudimentary goals that it has with nuclear weapons. And this is accepted by the international community, or rather, no, forget about international community, by security guarantor, right? By the patron state, patroning state.
You lost me on that one.
All right. I said if Russia is able to backstop its losses with threats to employ nuclear weapons to asymmetrically escalate, and it's not met with a direct response, and Poland and states like that see it, they don't see changes in, for example, declarative posture that NATO. There wasn't, like, 2022 NATO strategic concept. There was nothing there that changed really from 2010. Nothing.
That's why I said
US,
NATO doesn't have a strategy for this kind of this.
but it has a language, and as you pointed out, the flexible response language back then in the 60s and later on. It had a very direct language of what NATO would be willing to do. Whether it would do it or not, that's another question. But it had the language in place. And 2022 still doesn't. It still has the watered down, imprecise, unclear language referring to nuclear weapons. And if this continues,
that's why we tried to take sort of the flexible response levels and say we don't need the first use component of it. What we need is to be able to respond. And so we try to say, well, okay, so there, you need to be able to have all three of those components.
You don't need a first use component if you have conventional force enough, that is sufficient to do denial, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And so there's an interesting issue you raised. I'd like to go back before we end, because it relates to the idea of centers of gravity as well. And you mentioned China. So there's a set of assumptions that China is unhappy with. So this is kind of cool. Yeah. So this is sort of. Let me explain this, and then before we leave, do you mind if I go to back to China? So as you see on the left side of your screen is the three elements of flexible response, and then in 1977, NATO adopted as an amendment to the flexible response the long-term defense plan, which was focused on developing a competitive strategy, working on armament cooperation, and having a dual track. So we were in the process of putting Pershing and Glickam in, and the Russians, of course, had SS-20. But we also said, well, we need to be able to kind of at least consider each of those sides potentially backing out, which both sides did successfully 10 years later in the INF Treaty, which actually started the ball rolling to even end the Cold War. So that was kind of the framework. And then we, for our what we call reciprocal response, we go, so you still have forward defense, centers of gravity. You have greatly expanded the front. And the issue now is not deliberate escalation, it is escalation dissuasion. So back in 1972, Morton Kaplan and I did some work on the concept of dissuasion, which would have been long forgotten, except in the Junior Bush administration in 2001 or something, they brought back the term, the concept. And the nuance was, in deterrence, you're threatening response. In dissuasion, you're highlighting their advantages in not escalating. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and the inevitability of response, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And so then when you get to the higher level, you also have to have, to a certain extent, both a denial. You are not going to have the ability to completely save yourself, but having some degree of active defense, both in the theater and strategically, and having also the capability for calibrated retaliation. Again, calibrated to what they're doing. So that was kind of the way we approached it. And we said, this new strategy also needs a long range competitive strategy. Thinking about, so not just the next 5 years, but longer term. And we have the same challenge with rationalization is having making sense of various contributions. Standardization is pretty obvious. The big sort of innovation in long-term defense plan, NATO had long talked about standardization, and other than pistol ammo and rifle ammunition, had kind of sort of flubbed it because different countries wanted to do their own tanks, their own artillery. But starting in 77, NATO really adopted the idea, we want to standardize consumables. So we want to get to the point where people have standardized on 155, so everybody can share same ammunition. It's good to standardize on the 120 high velocity German gun, so that Americans, Germans can again have that standard and interop, and also standardize in terms of your communication, so you can talk to each other, and that's the part on interoperability. And then we also thought that there's a role for dual track, in particular in the current context of war termination. That is, support Ukraine to defeat the aggression and recover, while diplomatically convincing the invader to leave. And at the end, and this has been somewhat controversial since the report came out in Kiev, but we go, at some point, it's not infeasible to me that a government might replace Putin that wants per Macron to rejoin the Western community, and if they're willing to act responsible, there's no reason why We shouldn't, but we shouldn't have individuals running off trying to make deals, trying to act the hero, trying to play, oh, I have an idea. We need it to focus on what has to happen first, and then have a collective effort, like we did in the dual track that ended up well in terms of the INF trade. That's basically is the approach we took.
Okay.
So can I go back to China for a second?
Go ahead.
So there is you raise the issue of stability, and there's many definitions of stability. There are authors who are writing about it. But one element of strategic stability is the balance of major powers. And clearly, if you go back and look at the comments between Putin and Xi for all the way back to 16 or 17, they have been increasingly talking about a united effort to displace the United States as the superpower. So Russia had nuclear weapons that could be somewhat equivalent to the United States. China didn't at the time, but China had the economic strength. And you put those two together and you get kind of and thus the rise of tripolarity.
Which is inherently unstable as a system, right? Unlike
historically, it is, because you're always two against one. So somebody's going to join the other one. Where in the old balance of power, where you have five, for example, the Brits would sort of play the balancing act.
Yeah. Stupid remark, but I think there was a reason why in 1984 there were three powers constantly at war with each other. I don't know if you remember. Yeah.
Yeah. There was a joke going around when Brezhnev visited Washington back during the Nixon administration, and so Brezhnev and Nixon Nixon's giving a tour of the National Security Council, and he says, "Oh, here, I'll take you down to the war room," and he kind of show off. He says, "We have this computer, and it can predict the future." And Brezhnev's really impressed. He said, "Well, so he said, do you have a question? Well, who's going to win the Cold War?" So the Nixon gives the guy sitting at the code types that into the computer, and the computer is whirling and it keeps going. And Nixon said, "Well, come on, we need an answer." The guy said, "Well, I can't read it." He said, "What do you mean you can't read the result?" He says, "It's in Chinese." So even back in that period, people are already kind of conceptually thinking about it. I do not believe that the Chinese are either putting a brake on Putin or are particularly upset about it.
Mm-hmm.
Contrary to a lot of people, 3 months ago, everybody was saying, "Oh, well, Putin won't do any threats with nuclear weapons and stuff because he doesn't want. We don't want to irritate the Chinese." Well, they don't seem very irritated and have been doing a lot in terms of putting stuff in Belarus and making some very obnoxious comments. I don't think we've seen the end of China's role in this or attempt to play in it, and it can come out in many different ways. But I do not think they have abandoned Russia, and at least I would argue, because I can't predict the future, right? So I don't have access to inner councils in Beijing, but we should at least address seriously the question about that alliance, that mutual reinforcement community of states, Russia and China, continuing for a considerable while, and maybe even getting stronger, because the weaker Russia gets, the more they're going to need Chinese coverage. I'm not one who says, "Oh, well, therefore, we should intervene to help Russia." Come on. I think we're playing way over our ability to actually influence that kind of relationship, and we're kidding ourselves. But we certainly ought to be kind of conscious of it.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe the lessons learned from Ukraine are, in fact, being carefully
Oh, yeah.
considered in Beijing. Um, and I guarantee you they are going to think of take those into consideration. Um, so it's going to be it's going to be an interesting ride, and it also raises the question about typically you can't get have a conference in Europe and then so well what about the European pillar well you got two North American and 29 countries in Europe. Have fun. I mean, and I'm not trying to demean it, but I mean, particularly you hear this from Paris. Oh, we need a European center. Okay, have fun. So
Sure.
the biggest thing they did was a joint French German brigade that finally went away for lack of anything. Have fun. It's okay. The United States does not have to make all the decisions. We don't. One of the things that was fun about doing this report with the Canadian is a Canadian hubris was Canadian humility was a useful counter to American hubris. It's interesting, when Putin makes threats to NATO or to even Ukraine, everybody turns and they look at the United States. Nobody turns to the force de frappe and says, "Oh, what are the French going to do?"
I mean, they do have their brand of asymmetric escalation, but it's completely unusable for providing extended deterrence, right?
So one of
Shot
the
across
things,
the bow, this is useless.
so one of the things we suggested is rather than be viewed as the United States basically providing the nuclear thing, and the French and the British are doing their own. It would be useful to recreate the nuclear planning group that was and have a special place for the three nuclear powers so they can discuss things. Uh, and maybe they can come to some mutual issues, approaches, as well as bringing those countries that do permit the stationing of NATO nuclear, or whose pilots are actually would be flying nuclear missions, into the group, so that there is within there is an alliance. Yeah, to a certain extent, that didn't go away with the Cold War, but compared to what was done during the Cold War, it's a fraction of it. And with in this new era of lots of threats, I think it's something that should be taken seriously.
So before we end, and staying in the topic of nuclear sharing, uh, so here's the difficult question, because I couldn't speak of military art, but in terms of signaling strategic, resolve or changes to nuclear posture. Again, when we go back to strategic stability, to how the US has reacted, to how the US arms control community is reacting, for example, um, to the recent statement of Polish Prime Minister that Poland would like to join nuclear sharing, you could see that there is virtually zero appetite for that.
But let's get a couple things straight.
Yeah.
So I published in the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, and a number of older arms controllers were friends of mine. I did the study for the President of the United States on a world without nuclear weapon. Commissioned directly by the Secretary of State and Paul Nissa, the negotiator for the United Nations. But the current generation have grown up kind of in a different environment.
Exactly. Yeah.
And their focus is that the biggest problem of stability in the world is that the U.S. needs to be constrained.
Yeah.
I've actually had arguments with them. I go, because I was pushing, you may remember 10 years ago about what China was doing in terms of its buildup and stuff. And I go, we need to engage them in terms of, oh, well, they won't do it anyway. So, but let's don't provoke them. So all their constraints was focused on us in the West. And I think that's, I think that is a bankrupt approach. And I don't think it has a lot of credibility anymore. I think that the issue now is to be able to have not a radical, not some crazy stuff, but a very measured set of responses that does develop that posture. Having NATO nuclear assets in Poland, in my view, is very important. And when Sweden joins, I think having them, the Swedish Air Force, having the ability to have some be a part of that would make sense. And if and when Ukraine's war ends and Ukraine is the southern center of gravity, you could make a very strong case for them.
Sure.
So
Because
I would say to my Polish friends, you have it right. You understand. You are the new strategic center of gravity in the center. You understand the issues. Stay tough and stay the course.
because I would still like to go back and ask you actually later how exactly should we try to affect the change? Because right now I think both, if you look at U.S. nuclear posture review or whatever was published in public in October, I believe, last year. So basically, and the responses also from the government, from the U.S. government to Morawiecki's words, again, the nuclear sharing ones, you see an unwillingness to risk strategic stability and inadvertent escalation by enhancing the credibility of U.S. deterrence. At the same time, what's very predominant is the strain to be an arms controller, and I can understand one position or the other. You don't want to risk general nuclear war with Russia, so you're unwilling to enhance your credibility, develop posture, develop capabilities. And I get that. But at the same time, it's very hard to gel this together with being an arms controller because, it's like trying to have your cake and eat it at the same time. You don't want to enhance guarantees. You have to account the fact that there will be likely a proliferation pressure, right? So those two are crazy. But the thing is, and you said this, because this attitude could have worked at the time when any threat was very remote. So the unipolar moment, right? Then you could gel those two concepts together relatively pain-free. Right now, you can't do that anymore. The thing is, when will the US establishment reach that conclusion that, you can't do those things at the same time? And how, as an ally, do you affect that change? I mean, South Koreans gave an example of how to do it, but how do you think, what's the timeline and how to speed it up?
So if I'm understanding you correctly, you're saying that having a serious military response and having arms control are incompatible.
No, they are compatible. Not giving a strong military response and enhancing capabilities and being an arms controller. Those are because those guys say we don't want you to have nuclear sharing because it's unnecessary and risky, but we also don't want you to proliferate. So those two things, what I mean.
No, yeah. So well, the internal inconsistency is in the arms control community. Okay, but that doesn't mean that one cannot and should not have a dual track approach, in which you're saying we are going to respond. And we invite you, if you're going to be responsible, we invite you back into the thing. We're not trying to rub your nose in it, but there are certain things that you have to do to be accepted in the Western community. You want to go to the Asian community and act like Genghis Khan? Have fun. You want to be a satrap of China? It's okay with us. But if you're going to attack a European country to try to have some kind of imperial ambition, we're going to stop you and we're going to respond proportionally. So But the arms control community, the arms control community, I don't think so. I don't think what is behind U.S. policy is the arms control community. Some of them are certainly from it and stuff, but I don't find them that I think to a great extent a lot of their positions have become self-indicting and sort of lost credibility, particularly about China for one thing, but on a whole series of issues. We are at a changing moment, so we you know so.
So how do you go through one moment to another? How do you affect that change as an ally?
Well, first of all, how do you do it as an alliance, or even as a supervisor? I would say carefully. You know, don't get crazy. Don't you know?
Don't telegraph.
So one, I'll give you an example that drives me nuts. I don't think we should be announcing all the stuff that's going on to Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
It's crazy. Oh, another 10 tanks. Oh, another. No, just do it, and just get it there quietly. The Russians will see it. The Ukrainians will use it, right? But instead of this, it's coming. It's kind of a perpetual orgasm, always coming and never arriving, right? You look at the Western prevarication.
Mm-hmm.
So, but if you look at how much the administration has come, it's come a long way. The U.S. administration, they're learning, and other than Biden, there's very few people in the administration who were conscious of international events of the Cold War. It's interesting. You know who negotiated the Budapest Agreement, by the way? The guy's name was Blinken.
Wow.
But dad, not son. But so the people who are in positions of power throughout the West have grown up in the last 30 years, their consciousness, their political careers, their awareness, and they naturally reflect that kind of optimism and the end of history and blah blah, and it goes on and on and on. And well, that level of kind of naive approach is now being challenged. A number of those, not all, some are ideological, but I think the majority of those will end up having a more, quote, realistic. But people ask me, are you a tough realist? I'm a constructivist.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I believe in identity and the power of identity. Now, you can have all the identity you want. It's not going to necessarily stop a nuclear weapon, right? But collectively, it can have a huge impact on stuff. And you need to be tough where necessary, and you need to reach out and try to create a cooperative environment where possible. So I think there is a sort of self-education process that's going on. I mean, you see it with Macron, you see it with the German president, and now, what is the role of Poland in it? Well, first of all, and I cannot stress this enough, Poland it's not only the strategic center of gravity in the center, it is NATO's new strategic center of gravity. Okay? Mm-hmm. The appreciation of that is going to sink in to a whole bunch of people. As it does, you don't have to be, and I'm not criticizing, by the way, anything that Poland said or done, but you can take on the role of feeling much more secure in your own position, if that makes sense. Because your importance and your authority will be recognized without having to raise your voice.
Mm.
So now, I think it was a necessary statement that Poland made about asking for. I think other people are going to be. I think people in the United States are going to be thinking about. At first, was it an inconvenient statement? Maybe, but for some Americans, but I actually think it was well done. The only thing I caution is don't get carried away of being the agent provocateur, because you don't have to, because Poland is going to have the recognition and the role and responsibility of a major player. Get used to wearing those robes. I've said this before, and maybe this is a place to end. Being the new center of gravity in the center is both a blessing and a curse. A blessing in the sense that you're going to rise to a whole new. Just look at how what happened with Germany joining the alliance to by the end of the Cold War, the role that they were playing. I see no reason why Poland can't have that same vector in the alliance. On the other hand, the curse is that those who don't want to see that happen on the other side, the imperialists and their toadies, are going to do everything they can, just as they did in Germany. They're going to try and threaten you. They're going to try and infiltrate you. They're going to try everything possible to alienate you from your allies, destabilize you internally. And if ever there was a time to have strong, straight, I don't know what the Polish version of a Gerasaus, straight ahead. But that would be my best advice.
Fair enough, Doc. And I think on that note, it is time to end. It's almost 2.5 hours now. So again, thank you so much for being with us today. And again, I hope we're gonna run it again as a three-way very soon. So until next time.